Hello and welcome. Welcome to the last video in our Using the Comparative Historical Analysis Tool series. The content we've been using is from Grade 10, Unit 1, Early Modern Empires. Our video objectives today, we're going to write a comparative analysis using Step 5, the Comparative Historical Analysis Tool, and we're going to take a look at the language of comparison chart to see how it could help us craft a comparative analysis paragraph. In the previous videos, we read and annotated two sources on the Bourbon Dynasty and the Tokugawa Shogunate from Grade 10, Unit 1, Lesson 11, and we completed steps 1 through 4 of the Comparative Historical Analytical Tool. Today, we will use the evidence from steps 1 through 4 to construct a claim and write a comparative statement in step 5. So the first thing we had done in step 1 was put together all the evidence that we knew about the Bourbon Dynasty and the Tokugawa Shogunate, which were our case studies for empires. And we had looked at some documents, but we also added in some information from prior knowledge. So things that we knew about world history and about these empires. In step 2, we looked at the evidence we had, and then we tried to group them into some major points and major groupings. And we try to have at least 2, we have 3 here that could possibly work. And then we noticed there was definitely one that stood out for both of them. And that led us to step 3, in which we used the one that we had the most evidence for, which was centralization of power. We saw that in both of them. And then we tried to compare them. And we looked at, when we were comparing, we looked at not only how similar they were, but we also looked at the differences between the two empires and how they centralized power. Because when we're comparing, we're not only looking for how things are the same, we also look for how things might be different in doing almost the same thing. So our next step now is to put everything together, and we're going to use the evidence from steps 1 through 4 to create a claim comparing our case studies. Okay. And what we want to do is use at least a couple of comparative statements to really consider, like we mentioned before, both their similarities and their differences. And you may wish to look at the sentence starters in the language of comparison chart as well. So you may wish to pause here if you want to write your comparative historical analysis and then see how it works against mine. If you are unsure and you want to get some sentence starters, looking at the language of comparison chart might really help you when you're crafting this. So there's some thesis starters for that claim. If you are unsure, you can look at any of these as really good ways to start building your comparison. And then we even have some ideas if you want for how to compare. We have some sentence starters that could help you too. So look at the language of how we talk about comparison. We go both. We talk about while one is something, the other is something as well. We talk about one difference between. So it's important to know that we use those keywords of both and, similar, compared to, difference. It's important to use those words to signal to the reader that you are doing a comparison. So why don't we look at my sample and see how it fits? So I looked at my notes, I looked at my groupings, and then I looked at my comparison chart to put everything together. So in my comparative statement, during the period of 1600 to 1750, empires were built because rulers consolidated their power to control their empire. And that comes from my knowledge of empire building. Studying the Edo Palace and the Palace of Versailles helps to understand how both the Tokugawa Shogunate and the Bourbon Dynasty built their empires and centralized their governments. And here I let the reader know exactly what I'm going to be talking about, centralizing governments. And then this next paragraph comes from our evidence and our groupings as well. So while both, and note how I write the language of comparison, While both mandated that their nobles were tied to the palaces and that ultimately the ruler controlled finances and administration, there were also key differences. The Tokugawa shogunate required the domos to either give money or labor to build and expand Edo Castle. This was one way to make sure the shogun had control over the nobles. In the Bourbon dynasty, Louis XIV ruled as an absolute monarch and controlled his nobles by fostering a culture of loyalty and fear. Your comparative historical analysis could be very different from mine. Your statement could have other types of evidence, but I hope that you did use the language of comparison when you were doing it. If you wish, and this is always a step that we could do, you could go back and revise your statement and then see how your revised statement compares to your first statement. Hope that you have really enjoyed this series, and I'll see you next time.